Hopium Dealers Hall of Fame with a nod to Guy McPherson. I'm Michael Dowd, and I'm recording this in August of 2022. I'd like to start with the big picture. This is the last 800,000 years in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You can see the 8 peak glacials when the glaciers were maximally thick and south here in North America. Today, the carbon parts per million, or at least in July of 2022, was 422 parts per million. The Ice Age average was 200 parts per million. Pre-industrials, 280 parts per million. Agricultural and civilizational collapse become unstoppable at 360 parts per million because the climate stability needed for agriculture and civilization is between 280 and 360. That's why 350.org is all about trying to get carbon parts per million down to 350 or lower. Of course, we now know it's impossible. And we speak of climate change, but it's really climate mayhem. It's abrupt, runaway, and irreversible climate mayhem. And when you factor in nitrous oxide and methane, the CO2 equivalent is already over 500 parts per million. And what we know from history, this is the last 400,000 years, is that carbon dioxide, global temperature, and sea level all rise and fall in lockstep. Sometimes one of them leads, sometimes another leads, but they all rise and fall in lockstep. So we know that it's only a matter of time before global temperature and sea level rises considerably. This is painful, but it's true. We are 2 to 3 decades into abrupt runaway and exponentially accelerating, that is completely out of our control, climate mayhem. And this is a chart from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. And you can see all of our summits, agreements, promises, and pledges over the last 30 or more years are worse than meaningless. And the reason that they're worse than meaningless is they give us the delusion that we're making progress when the opposite is the case. For example, in the 1960s, carbon parts per million was rising at 0.9 parts per million per year. In the 1970s, 1.3 parts per million per year. In the 1980s and 90s, 1.5 parts per million per year. In the 2000s, 2 parts per million per year. In the 2010s, 2.4, and we're already at 2.6 parts per million per year. And that's just the CO2. Again, when you add nitrous oxide and methane, we're over 500 parts per million already. Now, denial gets a bad rap because denial is instinctual. Here's a rough definition of denial. Denial is the largely unconscious habit of thought, whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, our legacy, how we live, what is required of us, and/or our feelings of self-worth or superiority. Denial is also the instinctual impulse to reject or discount information that calls into question our hopes, our assumptions, or our expectations about the future. We all have denial instincts. I do, you do, everybody we know and love does. So we really can have compassion for ourselves and each other. And as I mentioned, denial often gets a bad rap. It's often just adaptive inattention. I love this quote from Stephen Jenkinson. Inattention to the world's ecological state is well advised because attention to it mitigates against your happiness, your contentment, and your sense of well-being. Having a conscience now is a grief-soaked proposition. Whatever spiritual awakening may have meant in past times and places, if you awaken in our time, you awaken with a sob. And here's another great quote from Stephen Jenkinson about hope-free love and action, hope-free grief. He says, grief requires us to know the time we're in. The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the 4-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful or hopeless. They are 2 sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. This is the painful thesis of this program and most of my programs. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable collapse for decades. This great acceleration of technology and market-driven ecocide is an easily verifiable fact. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. In fact, all you have to do is Google great acceleration. Evidence is also compelling that the vast majority of people will deny this, especially those still benefiting from the existing order, those legitimately concerned about the consequences of collapse, and those who fear that accepting reality means giving up. And yes, virtually all of us fit that paragraph somewhere. The history of more than 80 previous boom and bust societies, that is, progress, regress, rise and fall, clearly reveals how and why Homo colossus is destined for near-term extinction. Homo colossus is William Catton's term for industrial humanity. It's where each of us uses 20 to 50 times the resources and exudes 20 to 50 times the waste as Homo sapiens. Homo colossus is destined for near-term human extinction. That may or may not mean the extinction of Homo sapiens. It's certainly a possibility, a very real possibility. And paradoxically, hope-free collapse acceptance may be the only thing that can help us not make a bad situation worse and live fully, fearlessly, and deeply meaningfully, even at Teotihuacan, that is the end of the world as we know it. That's where we are, at Teotihuacan. When I sometimes say, when I've got a cat that says Teotihuacan, and I say, oh, it's an indigenous term, it's a Native American term. It means that things are collapsing, but look for opportunities to be a blessing to others. You'll be fine. Most people don't understand collapse. Collapse is not like a building collapsing. Collapse of ecosystems are very different. Collapse is when a gradual downward trend in biophysical health and well-being goes into unstoppable decline, runaway, out of control, such as abrupt climate change. Abrupt climate change is like 10,000 years of climate change in half a human lifetime. You're not going to know, for example, that the redwood forests, many of the redwood forests in California, Humboldt County, for example, are actually in collapse. The only trees that are producing cones are those that are artificially watered by parking lots and that sort of thing. My wife has documented this. So here's industrial civilization over the last 270 years. Just a quick look at when a gradual downward trend goes into out of control decline, runaway, unstoppable mode. This is known as the Great Acceleration of biospheric collapse. And here's 7 decades ago, 1950, that's usually when they all focus on. And then 2 decades ago was 2000. And any measure, absolutely everything that humans rely on, with no exceptions, is not just in decline, it's now in precipitous freefall, unstoppable. And if you Google Great Acceleration, you see all these wonderful charts. It talks about socioeconomic trends and Earth system trends, and it shows everything going up. And because of the way our brains work, we naturally think, oh, going up means better. Oh, no, because the things on the left are ecocidal trends, and the things on the right are Earth system collapse measures. This is got this from New Scientist, also the International Geophysical Biosphere Program. And the Great Acceleration, there's a book called The Great Acceleration, How the World is Getting Faster, Faster. And again, it's assumed to be a positive thing, and nothing could be further from the truth. Because what this shows is that socioeconomic trends, population, motor vehicles, fertilizer consumption, tourism, river dams, etc., these are the drivers of biospheric collapse. They're not positive at all. So these are ecocidal trends, and these are Earth system collapse trends. So to make this chart actually work for the way our brains work, we need to flip it upside down. The biosphere's health has been in decline for 1 or 2 centuries and in runaway collapse now for decades. This is known as the Great Acceleration of Gaian collapse. And again, any measurement, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, the ice, we're losing all the ice of the world. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. There's no exceptions. The oceans, the plankton, the corals, the fish, ocean acidification, oceanic dead zones and deoxygenation, that is loss of oxygen, and sea level rise. The amount of soil, the fertility of the soil, the moisture of the soil, and permafrost is releasing tons of methane, and it's already unstoppable. And we are now in a mass extinction, and there's only been one mass extinction in the past that We lost the insects and the forests, and we're now adding carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide faster than then. So hopium is a comforting vision of the future that requires breaking the laws of physics, biology, or ecology, such as thinking that we can slow, stop, or reverse the great acceleration of Gaian collapse. Here's the truth. As painful as it is, as repulsive as it is, unstoppable collapse. No matter what we do, literally, no matter what, these extinction level tipping points are already in the rearview mirror. We're not at risk of passing these. We ran over that dog 10 or 20 years ago. These are tipping points, thresholds that are already in the rearview mirror. Loss of the world's ice, the Arctic, Greenland, West and East Antarctica, and mountain glaciers. In fact, these three books, Henry Pollack actually is a neighbor here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Peter Wadhams, the top scientist in the world on this subject, Farewell to Ice. And then I consider Dar Jamel's The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption to probably be my favorite book on climate change. If you only read one book on climate change this year, read that one. They all talk about this. When most of the Arctic ice is gone, the serious global warming begins. And I'm not going to talk about this now, but learn about phase change and latent heat. You can Google it. Basically, when you've got a glass of water, as long as the ice is in there, even if the sun's beating on it, it stays at 32 degrees. Once the ice is gone, the temperature goes skyrocketing. Methane belching from the permafrost, the deep and shallow seas, hydrates and clathrates, tropical wetlands. Major paper came out just a few months ago that the tropical wetlands, the loss of methane is now in unstoppable mode, as well as the millions of wells. Ocean acidification, ocean deoxygenation, and at least 25 to 40 feet of abrupt, nonlinear sea level rise. I just talked to the former CEO of the Jacques Cousteau Society, John Englander, my latest post-doom conversation, and he talks about that. He verified that even if every human being went extinct tonight, stopping emissions immediately, we'd still see 25 to 40 feet of sea level rise in the next 2 centuries. The great conflagration, the great burning of the world's forests. This is already an out of control mode, and not just carbon dioxide, but methane and nitrous oxide as well. The boreal forests, where most of the carbon used to get stored in the Amazon rainforest and in the boreal forests of North America, of Russia, it's all Canada, it's all gone. It's no longer a carbon sink, it's now a carbon source. The loss of most species of animals and plants on land and in lakes, rivers, and oceans, and increasingly severe and deadly weather, storms, floods, droughts, hurricanes. Al Gore likes to say that just turning on the news anymore is like taking a nature walk through the book of Revelation. Guy McPherson has done more than anybody else in terms of summarizing dozens of tipping points. I highly recommend his climate change summary. It's very in-depth. Feedback loops already in unstoppable runaway mode. The truth, it's been said, will set you free. But first, it'll piss you off. This says it in itself. Here are 7 not just inconvenient truths, these are 7 odious truths, repulsive truths that few people know and even fewer can accept. All human-centered civilizations destroy their habitat, then self-destruct. We know of no counterexamples in all of human history, and we have over 100 examples of this. Technology in the market can't save us from the ecocide they always create. Again, there's no counterexamples. Climate change is not our worst predicament. Ecological overshoot is. We are decades into abrupt climate mayhem, unstoppable collapse, and a mass extinction that will likely include most plants, animals, and humans, and not in some distant future, most likely by 2040. The more rapidly industrial civilization collapses, the faster Earth heats up due to reduced pollution. This is known as the aerosol masking effect or global dimming. It's also sometimes known as the McPherson paradox. Denying the above betrays ignorance of the 5 main drivers of collapse and ecocide, and increases the likelihood of scores of nuclear meltdowns in the near future, the next decade or two. And yet most people will deny all this as long as possible, and will all suffer accordingly. Again, these are odious truths. These are repulsive. I don't want these to be true, and yet they are. And now this one, climate change is not our worst predicament. This is fundamental. If you don't understand this, you can't understand. You will absolutely have an inaccurate view of what's possible going forward. Richard Heinberg famously said, our fundamental problem is not climate change. It is overshoot, of which global warming is a symptom. Here's what we typically focus on, especially those of us who are activists: abrupt climate change, climate mayhem, death of the oceans, plant and animal extinctions, topsoil poisoning and loss, critical resource depletion, chemical and nuclear wastes, the growing gulf between the rich and the poor, economic instability and insanity, political polarization and conflict, the contracting of in-groups, the rise of totalitarianism and other isms. This is what we focus on, but these aren't the problem. These are all symptoms of ecological overshoot of carrying capacity. And that's an ecological term. Carrying capacity is there's a limit to how much we can take from the living world and a limit to how much waste we can exude to the living world before the systems start breaking down. That's known as the carrying capacity. I call it grace limits. There's a limit to how much we can take and a limit to how much waste we can give before we lose the grace of the systems we depend upon. And how we define and measure wealth, well-being, and success is the fundamental thing that determines truly sustainable, not quote unquote sustainable, faux sustainable, delusional sustainable, but how the difference between true sustainability and unsustainable. Human-centered, that is anthropocentric measures of wealth, well-being, and success are always ecocidal. Only life-centered measures, ecocentric measures. How well is the soil doing decade by decade? How well are the forests doing decade by decade? How well are the other species doing decade by decade? What's the carbon in the atmosphere decade by decade? Those are the only sane measures of wealth, well-being, and success. Human-centered measures, how wealthy is the king or the emperor or the GDP or the nation, or all that stuff is completely ecocidal. It's complete insanity. And these 3, abrupt climate mayhem, the death of the oceans, and plant and animal extinctions, these are already in near-term human extinction level runaway mode. Even if we could somehow miraculously solve the climate issue, which we can't fix it, we can't solve it. It's a predicament, it's not a problem. Even if we could, there are half a dozen other planetary boundaries that we have already overshot that are extinction level. So hopium, I want to come back here. A definition of hopium. Hopium is a comforting vision of the future that requires breaking the laws of physics, biology, or ecology. Hopium is addiction to false, literally impossible hopes. Irrational or unwarranted optimism that promises short-term relief, but delivers crushing disappointment and despair when reality inevitably bites. Hopium is any hope. I mean, hopes in themselves, there's nothing wrong with hope, but any hope that leads us to put off or not prioritize what matters most, individually and collectively, is hopium. And individually, it's like the things that matter most. If you were going to die, or if anybody in your life was going to die in the next year or two, there are things that matter most. And in terms of our species, it's doing things like getting all of the spent fuel rods out of the swimming pools, like ensuring as little nuclear, geological scale toxicity as possible, and assisting plants and trees in migrating. That's holy work. And we're going to put those things off if we hope that civilization can continue. And then believing that the climate crisis can be fixed or solved by doubling down on the very things causing ecocide in the first place. So that's hopium. Here's some examples of hopium. Believing that enough people can become climate aware in time to transform society and save Homo colossus. Believing that there's still plenty of time to figure out how to safely, permanently store spent nuclear fuel rods. Believing that human cleverness, technology, or the market can halt the ecocide that they always inevitably create. Believing that we can stop or reverse abrupt climate mayhem or biospheric and societal collapse. believing that things can or will return to normal, unaware that normal is precisely why we are so, yeah. Those most vulnerable to hopium, young people who expect a life like their parents or grandparents had, high schoolers agonizing whether college and college debt is worth it, couples trying to decide on marriage or whether to become parents, parents of young children or teenagers still living at home, older generations who are terrified or consumed with guilt when considering the world that their adult children and grandchildren will inherit. Now, those are more specific. Here's some that are more general. Any and all who lack an ecological understanding of history. Those who are unwilling or unable to trust reality as it really is, rather than as we wish it was. And devout believers in the secular religion of everlasting human progress, which is the main religion, the main civil religion of the 20th century, no question about it. Most of us were there. And yet what we now know that's factual is that human-centered progress is always ecocidal. Again, there's no counterexamples. I did 2 programs, one back in 2019, a little 24-minute program called Sane versus Insane Progress. And then a longer one in 2020, Collapse 101, the inevitable fruit of progress. And these 2 of my great mentors, these quotes that capture where I'm going with those. William Catton in Overshoot says, human society is inextricably part of a global biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. Thomas Berry, along similar lines, said the most difficult transition to make is from a human-centered to a life-centered norm of progress. If there's to be any true progress, the entire life community must progress. Any so-called progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. So when I use the term a hopium dealer, okay, the title of this program is Hopium Dealers Hall of Fame, and a nod to Guy McPherson. So hopium dealer, what I'm meaning is someone who ignores or is blind to our real predicament, ecological overshoot, and who proposes fixes or solutions to the climate crisis that actually rely on the very things driving collapse and ecocide in the first place. Here's a classic example. Here are some brilliant, big-hearted hopium dealers, the prophets of progress. Matt Ridley, the rational optimist. Peter Diamandis, Abundance, the future is better than you think. These are New York Times best-selling books. Factfulness by Hans Rosling, 10 reasons we're wrong about the world and why things are better than you think. And then, of course, Steven Pinker, the best known and probably best-selling of them all, his book Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. He has 75 charts. And in his earlier best-selling book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, talked about less violence. And he's actually right. He's correct in all these charts that he has. He shows that, less this and more that. And this, he's actually accurate on all that. He says it's never been better. Of course, he doesn't say for the most privileged, that's the truth. And he claims accurately that technological progress and expansion and economic growth and development are what has caused that. And he's right. The problem is that it's never been worse for everything we depend on. Nothing, there's no counterexample. There's nothing that we depend upon that isn't just in decline, it's in free fall. Overdevelopment, overpopulation, and of course, overshoot is what causes the climate chaos. Soil, forests, water, species, loss of soil organisms, nutrients, groundwater, glaciers, rapidly and significantly expanding deserts, deadly droughts, heat waves, hurricanes, flooding, oceanic acidification, and dead zones, plastic pollution, nuclear waste, toxic air, water, and soil, and the catastrophic loss of the vast majority of species, not just the ones we depend upon, but the ones that are needed all over the world in different ways. So let's call it what it is. It's technological devastation and ecocide, and economic growth and destruction. That's the truth. And how is it that Steven Pinker and these others prophets, how can they not see this? Well, as Steven Weinberg says, with or without religion, Good people can behave well and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. Now, of course, Weinberg was speaking of people who believe in monotheistic religion, but it goes even more so with those who believe in the secular religion of perpetual progress. Here's the creation story of the secular myth of perpetual progress. You got the Stone Age, cavemen, savages, primitives, hunter-gatherers. The agricultural revolution, notice the positive term, farming, cities, civilization. The Enlightenment, reason, science, humanism, progress. The reason I have exclamation points is that's the breathless enthusiasm with which these prophets of progress speak. The Industrial Revolution, again, notice the positive term. Fossil fuels, technology, globalization, space travel. And I don't know of a techno-optimist that doesn't have a Star Trek vision of the future. I certainly did for many years, from the caves to now to the stars. That was my vision from 2000 to 2012. I now call this the techno-idolatrous ecocidal myth of man, conqueror of nature, the single most self-destructive and ecocidal thought form in human history. We're used to thinking of civilized as good and primitive as bad. Well, these quotes will call that into question. Forests precede civilizations and deserts follow them. All of our exalted technological progress, civilization for that matter, is comparable to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. Civilization is a hopeless race to discover remedies for the evils it produces. The end of the human race will be that it will eventually die of civilization. And the earth is littered with the ruins of empires and civilizations that once believed they were eternal. Now, these are heavyweight quotes, and this last one isn't an exaggeration. There was an article that came out a few years ago in the BBC. Luke Kemp wrote it. It's called "Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse?" And he's got this chart that shows 88 ancient civilizations, just between 3000 BCE and 1000 of the Common Era. Just that 4,000 year period, there's 88. If you go back before 3000, before the Common Era, and you look at the last 1,000 years, it's well over 100. And what we now know, we don't believe this, we know this, is that collapse is a feature. It's not a bug. Collapse is a feature of all human-centered, anthropocentric civilizations. As the famous 20th century historian Arnold Toynbee said, great civilizations are not murdered. They take their own lives. And we know how. Here's how human-centered civilizations consistently commit ecocide or suicide. And again, this is only the last 5% of human history, the last 8,000 years, 400 generations, not the 20,000 generations that we live more or less sustainably. That is where we preserve the well-being of the ecosphere upon pain of death or ostracizing. We have over 80 examples. And here's the pattern. Roughly takes 225 to 325 years. We see progress, rise, boom. This whole process is overshooting of the carrying capacity, taking more and exuding more waste, and the systems then start to break down. And then we see regress, fall, bust. And this is an unstoppable process of collapse. There's no example in human history of a civilization or empire or society becoming sustainable on the way down. It can't be done. It's physically impossible. It would have to break the laws of physics, biology, and ecology. It's never happened. It's unstoppable. But notice the inner world of our feelings and our expectations. Because if you're born and you die in times of progress, in times of expansion, well, of course, you expect your kids and grandkids are going to have it better than you, wealthier, easier. I mean, unless you're a slave. I mean, for the elites, but not the non-elites. But of course, you expect that. It's just the way things are. And if you're born and die in times of contraction, in times of collapse, in times of regress, well, of course, your kids or grandkids are going to have it more difficult than you. You just expect that. That's just the nature of the times. It's when you're born in times of expansion and it shifts in your lifetime. Until you accept it, that's hell. You go back and forth, hope, fear, hope, fear, hope, fear, or you resent it. That's denial or the sense of doom until you accept it. Only when you accept this hope-free acceptance can you truly dwell in what I'm calling post-doom. This is a fundamental distinction. William Catton has the whole first section of his book, Overshoot, on the distinction between problems, which can be potentially solved, and predicaments that can't. Death, for example, is not a problem to be solved. It's a predicament that we have to live with and then ultimately die with. This idea that we must take action, this is what we hear everywhere. We must take action. Well, no, it actually turns out that if you lack an ecological understanding of human history, the very actions you're likely to take are going to make things worse. William Catton, the most important book I've ever read in my life. Nothing else even close to it. I've recorded the whole thing on audio. It's up on SoundCloud. Overshoot, the ecological basis of revolutionary change. Many people consider it the most important book of the 20th century. Here's the thesis. He says, today humanity is locked into stealing ravenously from the future. That's what this book is about. A major aim is to show that commonly proposed solutions for problems confronting us are actually going to aggravate those problems. In order to truly understand our predicament and not make things worse, we need a clear-headed ecological interpretation of history. And that middle paragraph there, that commonly proposed solutions are going to make things worse, that's this idea that we must take action. That's what almost all the actions do, is they make things worse. Ecological understanding of the human predicament indicates that we live in times when the habit of asking, all right, now what must we do about it, must be replaced by a different query that does not assume that all problems are soluble. What must we avoid doing to keep from making a bad situation unnecessarily worse? I would argue that the number one, the top cause of climate anxiety, environmental dread, and doomed to fail anti-future policies is hopium. Hopium addiction sabotages our ability to think, feel, and live in right relationship to reality. Without an ecological understanding of history and human nature, people invariably have distorted views of what is possible. Hopium thus leads good people to set their sights on what will ultimately lead to geological scale evil. And young activists are especially prone to hopium fantasies, which is why best-selling peddlers are so ubiquitous. That's why I'm making this video. I can always tell if somebody's read William Catton's Overshoot or not, because if they haven't, they always have, virtually always have, a completely diluted understanding of what's possible going forward. Here, for example, are some climate solutions. Many people think of these as solutions that actually make things worse. Renewables, nuclear, wind and solar, fusion, space colonization, electric cars, green economy, carbon sequestration, carbon taxation, carbon credits, biofuels, super batteries. They all make things worse because they all exacerbate and extend ecological overshoot. And each one relies on the main drivers of collapse and ecocide to persist. So what I'm meaning when I use the phrase a hopium dealer is someone who ignores or is blind to our real predicament, ecological overshoot, and who proposes fixes or solutions to the climate crisis that actually rely on the very things driving collapse and ecocide. Again, I'll say a lot more about this in my program that I do on that topic. How to tell whether or not a vision of the future is laced with hopium. Some basic questions. Does it require extraction and/or exploitation? Does it require industrial infrastructure or processes? Does it require electricity at any point in its life cycle? Does it benefit humans but harm other life forms or processes? Does it ignore that biospheric and civilizational collapse is already unstoppable? Yes to any of those questions means you're dealing with hopium. Does it rely solely on current flows of energy and materials? Does it mimic nature's technology and become food at its end? Does it help us to relate to Gaia or God, G, Earth emoji, D, life personified? Does it help us to relate to Gaia, the biosphere, more healthfully? Does it preserve the well-being of the systems that make human life possible? No equals hopium. Any of those questions. William Catton, his last chapter of the book is Facing the Future Wisely. Again, this was written in 1980, and it's still totally current. Our best bet, he says, to expect the worst. He says, only by assuming the worst and acting accordingly do we have any real chance of avoiding the worst. And of course, we didn't take his counsel in 1980 nor since. And that's the key. All of us, including myself, who were hopium dealers or still are, don't assume the worst. So here I am at the Library of Congress in 2007. This picture was taken. John Mather is on the left. He's NASA's senior astrophysicist, the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in physics. The guy on the right is Craig Mello. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in medicine and physiology. The reason that we were there was because I am, or I was, for 2000 to 2012, a notorious hopium peddler. I was, the media called me America's evolutionary evangelist. And I wrote a book that both of them endorsed. In fact, John Mather said the universe took 13.7 billion years to produce this amazing book. I heartily recommend it. That was a great blurb from an amazing guy. And then Craig Mello, the science versus religion debate is over. A must read for all, including scientists. My book ended up being endorsed by 6 Nobel Prize winning scientists and over 100 other science and religion leaders. And I actually don't recommend it. I'm a religious naturalist. I'm an eco-theologian. Right there, I was going to do it. I was going to include it in this video, but I felt it was just too silly, too promotional. But the book trailer, the 80-second book trailer that you can find right there, is actually one of the things that helped my book become a bestseller. And even though it had all these endorsements, I don't recommend it because 85% of it I still agree with. But the 15% that's hopium, it's like saying, oh, here's a gourmet meal. Only 15% of it is fentanyl, but the rest is nutritious. No, don't buy my book, please. So here are some other brilliant, big-hearted hopium dealers, best-selling futurists and eco-modernists. Ray Kurzweil, The Age of Spiritual Machines. I used to sell that book. And The Singularity is Near. Kevin Kelly, been to his house twice. The Inevitable. Understanding the 12 technological forces that will shape our future. And then Roger Bregman's Utopia for Realists. These other books, The Second Machine Age and Industries of the Future. Ray Dalio's New York Times bestselling book, The Changing World Order. And then, of course, the 2 best-known eco-modernists, Bjorn Lorgenberg, False Alarm, and then Apocalypse Never by Michael Schellenberg. These are all brilliant, big-hearted hopium dealers. The IPCC and the United Nations Sustainable Development. The age of sustainable development is like saying the age of dry water. It's an oxymoron. It's not possible. Development itself is unsustainable. Big History. These are brilliant, big-hearted hopium peddlers and friends and colleagues. I love these people. I've counted them as close colleagues for many years. David Christian, his Maps of Time, 2 volumes. And then his most recent book, Origin Story, Big History of Everything. Big History by Cynthia Stokes Brown. Also Big History, Small World. Fred Spear, Big History. And then this is a coffee table book, amazing book. And then another coffee table book here, Big History. Now, these, again, 80 or 90% of these books are still fabulous. There's great stuff there, but there's at least 10 or 15% of hopium. And this, I actually was asked to review this. They sent me these 3 volumes for free. And after 2 months of agonizing, I had to send them back. I couldn't, in integrity, review them. Because this idea that we're going to live among the cosmos from the Big Bang to galactic civilizations, there will never be galactic civilizations. It's a total delusion. It's complete hopium. Climate bestsellers. I bought these books. I was nourished by these books. I love these books. I sold them for many years. Storms of My Grandchildren, James Hansen. Paul Gilding, The Great Disruption. Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World. Bill McKibben has been amazing. His Earth, his new book, Falter. Al Gore has been writing amazing things. Stephen Koonin, I've not read that one, Unsettled, but these are climate bestsellers. And most of them are great, but there's tremendous hopium in all of them as well. Naomi Klein, both her new books. David Wallace Wells, The Uninhabitable Earth. Again, 95% of that book is fabulous, but there's 5% that is totally ecologically clueless and techno ridiculous. All we can save: truth, courage, and solution for the climate crisis. And then the future we choose. See, these are all climate bestsellers, and they've got hopium. Robert Wright has been just an absolute dear colleague. He gave us 125 copies of Non-Zero just as a gift. And then Dwayne Elgin has been a friend and colleague for many decades, Awakening Earth and Promise Ahead, a vision of hope and action for humanity's future. Ken Wilber, been to his house. These are men that I love, that I appreciate, that I respect, The Theory of Everything. And then John Stewart. I was evangelistic about this book for many years. And then Carter Phipps actually has a whole chapter where he talks about my work and others in this movement. And I will say this, that Dwayne Elgin, his new book, Choosing Earth, Humanity's Journey of Initiation Through Breakdown and Collapse to Mature Planetary Community. I still think there's a little hopium in there, but I got to say this. His wife, Colleen LeDrew Elgin, this documentary, Choosing Earth, it's facing adversity, choosing Earth, choosing life. I consider it a 70-minute must-see documentary. It is absolutely fabulous from start to finish, and it'll leave you in tears. I highly recommend it. This idea that we need a better story. David Corton, been to his house a couple of times. Again, these are longtime friends and colleagues. Charles Eisenstein, I know Charles, we're not close friends or anything else, but he is deeply respected in this movement. This idea that if we just have the better story. Here's the painful truth. Without understanding ecological overshoot, good people with the best of intentions will support policies that are actually destined to drive millions of young people into despair and to make a bad situation catastrophically worse. Paul Hawken, I've respected him and considered him an older brother on the path literally for 30 years. And his book, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, no, that's complete delusional. And his most recent book, Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation. He thinks that the answer is electrification. No, it's not. Speed and Scale. Again, these are New York Times bestsellers. Mark Jacobson, 100% clean, renewable energy and storage for everything. He calls it the Solutions Project. And then Bill Gates' new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need. Michael Mann's new book, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. And a lot of my friends and colleagues love this book, Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. Degrowth we're going to have no matter what. And there's tons of great stuff in these books, but they're also filled with hopium. It turns out that most of my most cherished colleagues unknowingly peddle at least a little bit of hopium by advocating what they believe, what they genuinely believe are possible futures, but aren't, because their possibilities just exacerbate overshoot, and they assume the core drivers of ecocide and collapse. And here's the real paradox. Even some of the world's most esteemed doomer experts on abrupt climate change are not immune to occasional or chronic hopium, or what I call planmeister fantasies, that if we just have the right plan and enact the right plan. Peter Wadhams, Paul Beckwith, and Sam Karenna. I put quotes because Sam Karenna is probably a collective. It's a pseudonym. But in any case, Sam Karenna ends all of his posts with, we just need to do this plan, and it's complete hopium. I love this quote from Joseph Brodsky. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1987. He says, you Americans are so naive. You think evil is going to come into your houses wearing big black boots. It doesn't happen like that. Look at the language. It begins in the language. Pure, I suggest these statements are pure, uncut, pharmaceutical grade hopium. Our situation's dire. We're at risk of passing critical tipping points. If we all work together, we can still rein in rising temperatures. It's not too late to fix the problem with a green energy revolution. We're making progress in the fight against global warming. We can solve the crisis and get to net zero emissions. The window of opportunity for bold action is closing. Green technology, green growth can reverse climate change. We must declare a climate emergency as soon as possible. What if we were to actually tell the truth? We are decades into biospheric and civilizational collapse. It's utterly impossible to win the fight against climate. The window of opportunity for transformation never existed. There are no solutions, and net zero is a fairy tale delusion. Green technology, green growth will just exacerbate climate mayhem. Turns out that the key to sanity and to limiting long-term evil is accepting what we cannot change, changing what we can as soon as possible, and having enough hopium clean time to know the difference. So I want to just take a few minutes to conclude. Here are the resources that I consider the best of the best in terms of hopium detox and recovery. On my postdoom.com page, the best source of audios, videos, documentaries, podcasts, blogs, literally the best resources that I'm aware of and that other people tell me about are all accessible on the resources page of the Postdoom website. For example, one of the things I've got there is this: the best videos, audio, and text. And this is the core. The ones at the top are the best videos for understanding reality that I'm aware of. The best videos for coping and adapting to reality that I'm aware of are there. And then these here, Collapsosaurus Rex and John Michael Greer, I cannot recommend these too highly. They're fabulous. And then all of these are how to have joy and gratitude without hopium. That is hope-free. And I recommend all of them. But especially Collapsosaurus Rex, wonderful humor, just absolutely priceless. And one of the main reasons why so many people have an inaccurate understanding of what's possible is they've got a completely false understanding, a delusional understanding of evolution, history, and progress. And so I highly recommend John Michael Greer there. Also, I have this on that same page, Abrupt Climate Mayhem, Tipping Points. And it turns out that virtually all the major contributors in this field stand on the shoulders of Guy McPherson. Some of them may or may not like Guy McPherson. That's irrelevant. We all stand on the shoulders of Guy McPherson and are deeply indebted to him. As I mentioned before, his climate change summary is the best summary of dozens of tipping points. His two books, these are updated versions, 2019, Going Dark and Only Love Remains. I recommend them both. The thing about Guy McPherson, I did a video because I had people asking me questions for many years. And I did a video recently. In fact, the last video I did was called Dowd on McPherson. Just did it last month. And I honor Guy McPherson for boldly, tirelessly, and sacrificially popularizing the most repulsive, indeed the most nauseating scientific knowledge in human history. This video just in the last month has 9,600 views as of today and 600 comments. And what blew me away is that 98% of them, virtually all of them, are positive comments. And the few that aren't actually have great suggestions for improvement. I'll mention that here in a minute. But I also learned rather painfully that if you don't understand religious naturalism, and I stupidly assumed that people would understand religious naturalism, and it was an unfair assumption. Connie and I go to graveyards all the time. For us, graveyards are sacred. They're holy. We visited all over North America. We visited hundreds of graveyards in the last 20 years. For me, that they're more sacred than sanctuaries or temples or mosques or any buildings at all. And that one right there is a tombstone that says McPherson. And so I've been wanting to do a video on Guy McPherson for a long time. And so I thought, oh, this is kind of fun, and I just stupidly was thinking that people wouldn't misunderstand it. Well, that was silly. I'm a religious naturalist, as I mentioned before. Taking nature to heart is Connie's and my fundamental worldview. In fact, here's my creed in a nutshell. This is sort of an eco-theo credo for we religious naturalists. Reality is our God. Evidence is our scripture. The epic of evolution is our creation story. Ecology is our theology. Integrity is our spiritual path. And come home is our core message. Now, come home to who? Come home to what? Well, come home to reality. Come home to life. Come home to your true self. On the Post-Doom website, on the discussions, we've been having an 8-part series on death, dying, and sacred endings. And just the last one that I did on session 3 was called Death Through Deep Time Eyes. And I talked there about how I inadvertently and stupidly alienated 2 people who were precious colleagues and friends. And I inadvertently just totally pissed them off, understandably. I didn't mean to do it, but I did. So I talk about that there, Death Through Deep Time Eyes. It'll give you an understanding of how and why Connie and I have such a sacred, meaningful, inspiring, science-based understanding, purely science-based understanding of death. So on this video here, if you sort by top comments and just read a dozen or more, or if you start at the 34-minute mark and watch the last 7 minutes, you'll be able to see why it is that, thankfully, almost everybody understood that this was a deep honoring of Guy McPherson. I wasn't putting him down as some of my colleagues thought. I also got myself in trouble by saying this. I said in 2014, I hoped Guy McPherson was wrong, and now I consider him a modern day prophet. Well, again, I kind of stupidly assumed that people would understand what a religious naturalist means when we use the word prophet, but that was a goofy assumption on my part, because most people don't think of prophet that way. They think of an otherworldly, supernatural, predicting person. So from a religious naturalist perspective, a prophet is simply one who speaks on behalf of evidential reality with clarity and with courage. And that's what I meant, and that's what I mean when I call Guy McPherson a modern day prophet. And again, fortunately, the vast, vast, vast majority of people who commented on really got that. There's nothing supernaturally predictive or otherworldly about it. So I mentioned that the critical comments were really useful and really helpful. And so the questions that I'm often asked, why I created this video in the first place, is, people would say, well, why haven't you had a post-doom conversation with Guy McPherson? I mean, you've had 85 others. Why didn't you have him? He's like the granddaddy of post-doom. And what's your history with Guy? And what do you honestly think of him? And then especially, why do you recommend his work so highly when he denounces you, as he did in one of his videos? And then where do you agree? That is, where do you align? And where do you disagree or diverge with Guy McPherson? Well, it's that last one that actually I have had a radical change of heart, because what I said in that video was that where Guy McPherson and I agree is virtually all the science. I'm not aware of any significant place in the science where we disagree. And what I said in that video was where we differ was some of the relational stuff, specifically around nature, love, relationships, and grief. And if I were to redo that video now, I would change it, because since recording Dowd on McPherson, I've discovered that Guy and I really do not differ nearly as much as I thought in these 4 areas. And I now see that where we diverge or disagree as really largely a matter of how our respective brains work and our differing life experiences. And I'm especially grateful for Pauline for rather powerfully and pointedly making that case and convincing me that she was right. So these are especially recommended Guy McPherson videos and peer-reviewed papers and books. And I mentioned this, I also have this at the end of the Guy McPherson video that I did, because these are fabulous. I love all these. This is like the best of the best. If you're going to explore Guy McPherson, which I highly recommend, here are my recommendations. And I'll also have all of these links in the description box of the YouTube video. So I'm not going to talk about each one of these now, but I encourage you to check them out, because these really are. I mean, Guy McPherson is so prolific. He's got so many great things that he's written and so many things that he's done video-wise. And, some of it people object to for whatever reason, but I say just explore these with an open heart and an open mind. So let me wind this on down. Hope-free means kicking the hopium habit. How? By accepting what is inevitable and or what is unstoppable. And this is where I find Guy McPherson's work to be invaluable. Nature Bats Last is where you can find all of his stuff, guymcpherson.com. This short paper, Becoming Hope-Free, parallels between the death of individuals and the extinction of Homo sapiens. It's great. And I've recorded the whole thing. It's only 15 minutes. And my own attempt at this hope-free, kicking the hopium habit, is this video that I recorded a few months ago, Hopium Detox and Recovery, Accepting and Trusting Unstoppable Collapse. Now, I've mentioned Guy McPherson and recommended him highly here, and I want to mention just a few other hopium-free colleagues whose work I greatly admire. Margaret Wheatley, Collapsosaurus Rex. I don't even know who that is. It's fabulous. He's fabulous. Catherine Ingram, Paul Trafurka, Sid Smith, X-Ray Mike. Again, I don't know who he is, but he's awesome. Eric Michaels, Carolyn Baker, Karen and Jordan Perry, Dean Splain Walker, Kevin Hester, and Dar Jamel. You can't go wrong with these people. They're fabulous, hope-free or hopium-free colleagues, and I highly recommend their works, along with Guy McPherson's, of course. And my next video, I'll be recording it actually in a few days, called 5 Main Drivers of Collapse and Ecocide. I've made reference to, the main causes of ecocide, the main drivers of collapse and ecocide. And this, I think, I've got more passion for this topic than perhaps anything else, because coming back to Catton's quote, in order to truly understand our predicament and not make things worse, we need a clear-headed ecological interpretation of history. And that's what most scientists don't have, understandably so. So when I critique myself from 2000 to 2012, but also all these other friends and colleagues as being hopium dealers, I'm not meaning it in anything other than a factual understanding that most scientists don't have a clear-headed ecological interpretation of history. That's why I'm so evangelistic about William Catton's book, Overshoot. My way of interpreting that is without, and I mentioned this earlier, without an ecological understanding of history and human nature, people invariably have distorted views of what is possible. Said it another way, without understanding Overshoot, good people with the best of intentions will support policies destined to drive millions of young people into despair and make a bad situation catastrophically worse. And that's my program that I'll be doing here in a few days on the 5 main causes and drivers of collapse and ecocide. That's what we gain from an ecological understanding of history and human nature. Here they are, just in brief. Anthropocentrism, civilization, technology, progress, and economics. And really, I could say that anthropocentrism, or human-centeredness, is the soil out of which the other 4 emerge. So anthropocentrism is human-centered values and worldview. Civilization, extractive, exploitative, totalitarian, Overshoot are us. Technology, science and technology that's self-centered, that's human-centered, this idea of man, conqueror of nature. And even electricity. Now, electricity, people sometimes think, well, we need to generate electricity through wind and solar and so-called renewables. No, it's the generation of electricity that is itself unsustainable, always ecocidal. Progress, how we measure wealth, well-being, and success. And then having any trade system, monetary systems that reward and incentivize evil. So my next short video, shorter than most of them, will be on this. And then finally, I just recommend the Post-Doom website. 85, actually, I think 87 conversations now on the Post-Doom site. The best of the best resources. In fact, if you look at that page and you can think of anything that's important that's not listed there, please let me know. And then discussions where we can support each other in adapting and coping with all of this understanding. And please make sure you read the definitions of doom and post-doom. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention.